Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce our next and final speaker for today's conference, Mr. Gabrielius Landsbergis, who currently is a Bernard and Susan Liautaud visiting fellow at Stanford University and a member of the advisory board of the Munich Security Conference. Of course, Mr. Landsbergis is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Lithuania. Mr. Landsbergis, thank you for joining us for this conference.
It's a pleasure.
This session is called Misperceptions, and the title of our conversation with Mr. Landsbergis is following: Where the West Gets Russia Wrong. So the focus of our talk will be on this side of a border, the questions where we, the West, should improve our perceptions of Russia. Mr. Landsbergis, I would like to begin by asking, during your time at the ministry, what were the main intellectual bottlenecks or mantras that you witnessed while talking with colleagues from our allied countries when it comes to understanding Russia?
Well, that's a fundamental question that you're asking. I have perceived probably two lines of thought that mostly resonate within the Western societies and drive the thinking and the policies towards Russia, first and foremost, but also the way that we're dealing with geopolitical threats arising from interacting with Russia. So first is I would say that probably a smaller group of people, at least smaller vocally, who downplay the risks of Russia. It's based on on one side it's a rightful assessment that has formulated after the end of Cold War that Russia has been defeated and has been defeated quite totally. That is now, apart from its nuclear weapons, it's weak. Weak power, weak economy, and it's sliding downwards. And this assessment is a dangerous one because it does not allow to see the risks that the country might, even if it's on its way down, can the damage that it can do to its neighbors while on the way down. We often have to state that despite the fact that even if I would agree with that assessment that Russia is obviously no longer a geopolitical global power as it was during the Cold War, it still is a major risk to European countries, especially witnessed during the last four years. And that means that it needs a serious deterrence, serious reflection. How do we deter and how do we defeat the adversary if it decides to escalate war further, or at least how do we defeat it in Ukraine? The second group of countries, not countries, but I mean the thinkers would they fall into this group of people who admit or agree with the notion of victimhood. That Russia is some sort of a great power that has been unjustly treated, usually using a reference to a post-First World War Germany. As in the 1990s are akin to a Weimar Treaty, and we should have been dealing with Russia with more respect, adhering to its reasonable interests that somehow go beyond Russia's borders, and so on and so forth. So again, this is one of the notions that we usually we find ourselves needing to push back on. Right, so that and clearly Russia is very skillfully using the both. On one hand, it's still a great power. On the other hand, it's the victim of Western supposed aggression of the Cold War, and both both misconceptions do not allow to see the reality as it is. And Russia is not a victim, unless not a victim of Western action. It's the only victim is, its own leadership and the choices that it made. And it's also that it is a power in decline, but the power in decline that can wreak a lot of havoc and do a lot of damage on its way down.
Thank you. Thank you. We've been talking a lot throughout this day about history and the sort of a history of Russian imperialism. And in your view, do you think that the West still underestimates the continuity of Russian imperial thinking, from Tsarism to the Soviet Union to the contemporary Putinism, and why is this continuity so hard for the Western policymakers to grasp?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it is not accepted. Rarely do the Baltic states are understood well when we say that we have also experienced colonialism. That 50 years of Soviet occupation was in effect Soviet colonialism. And even though Russia presented itself as anti-imperial, an anti-Western and anti-imperialist power, all the way from Lenin to Stalin, all the way till the end of Cold War, it in effect was nothing. The differences were not there. It colonized big part of Eurasia continent. It enslaved free peoples. It Russified entire nations, destroyed identities, and forced people to Russian language, culture, traditions, even religion, whatever. And so from our perspective, it is. We share the same colonial story as do many countries in among the global partners. Unfortunately, that narrative is very difficult to explain. Maybe it's due to our inability to tell the story right, or maybe it's due to just inherent belief that that this Russia's supposedly anti-imperialist stance is somehow real, or it also can be that the West has not yet entirely dealt with its imperial past, and that forbids being very transparent in or having a real ability to reflect on Russia's imperialism. But that should not deter us. I think that is, one of the major and very important goals of the Baltic states or countries in the eastern flank, to continue telling the story that it is, in fact, the same Russia that we have seen in 19th century, Soviet Russia that carried the tradition in 20th century, and Putin's Russia that is continuing on the same route.
Yep, I would like to now jump into the more contemporary questions, and let me raise a slight delicate question, and indeed a sensitive question, I think. Do you think that the West should rethink its, I would say, romanticized view of the Russian opposition? In other words, what is realistic and what is a fantasy in today's Russia?
You mean Russian opposition as the one that fled Russia?
Well, in general, I would say, of course, in general, yeah.
But not like our opposition to Russia, but the
no. Of course, Russian opposition who fled Russia and who are still, perhaps, and several of them are still in Russia on some basis.
Well, that's a very difficult question. I think it starts, first of all, with Russian opposition first coming to terms. I mean, so first disclaimer, we have to be clear and mention that there are several elements within the Russian opposition. Right? So you have, Garry Kasparov, who is, on one side of a spectrum, and then you have others. Okay, I don't necessarily need to mention all of them, but you probably would guess, people who are have different position and an approach to contemporary Russia. So there are factions, there are groups, right? So it's probably as democratic as Russian opposition can be, right? That's the best part of it. Now, if we try to generalize the Russian opposition, then it is clear that Russian opposition is caught between the two pillars. One pillar is how do they want to be perceived in Russia? And I think that this is what many within Russian opposition are still struggling with. They believe that if Russian power monopoly, the Putin's power monopoly would fall, they need to maintain ability to be electable within Russian society. And there are certain points that they are making, the political points that they are making, let's say about the Ukrainian territorial integrity, about the sanction policy, Western sanction policy, in my eyes is the thinking, you could call it wishful thinking, but it's, again, in the eyes of the beholder, maybe they think that it, it helps them to be electable when elections come in Russia, right? Or at least not to lose the ties to Russian population. For us, it tells a very simple story that if that is true, that means that they reflect a wider sentiment in Russian society, which in turn means that Russian society is imperialistic, because if even Russian opposition cannot shred the remnants of this imperialistic ideology, that like I mentioned, for example, about territorial integrity of its neighbors, that in turn leads me to believe that the whole points about Putin's, if it's a Putin's or Russians war, is basically answered by Russian opposition themselves. If they cannot say who does Crimea belong to, that means that Russian people cannot say that. That means that unfortunately we have to admit that the war is Russia's war and not just single person Putin's war. But then the second pillar is the acceptance of Russian opposition within Western society. We have always been of an opinion that, and it's basically at this stage, it's either or. If you want to be electable in imperialist Russia, it is very likely that then you will not be accepted in the West as a person who adheres to the same rules like a Western person or Western politician. And for Russian opposition, it is that they basically have to choose which side of the spectrum you want to be. And unfortunately, there is very little space, and I think that this space will be shrinking ever further as time goes. People still do support Russian opposition, even despite their kind of strange musings about the current Russian choices. But I think that this support might shrink further as time goes, and that will force Russian opposition to choose where do they want to be, whether they want to be electable in Russia, or do they want to be to have to maintain reasonably well preservable ties with the Western societies.
Well, I think you summarized it fundamentally in a way. Thank you for that. I don't remember reading that's sort of a very conceptualized portrait of current challenges for Russian opposition and our policies vis-a-vis it. While continuing this sprint of a conversation, jumping back to the West, you are yourself at the moment at Stanford University, and I would like to ask about the question of that. Do you see any problems in the West when it comes to the teaching international relations or international politics and how it affects our Russian policy and our understanding of Russia?
I think that we are caught in the moment where we don't know what to teach about Russia. There are people who base their thinking, from the Cold War, and and it relates to to your first question, like how do we perceive Russia? What is Russia today? So that means that certain notions, if are coming from the 1990s, and like the last war that we fought, well, be it Cold War, it ended, and everything that we see now is still a reality that has been started there. And now we're just in the outcome period. Well, I think that we are in somewhat new reality that is formed not around Russia, but around what we should be calling a Cold War 2.0. That is great power competition. Again, the second chapter of it, the United States versus China, and the Russian war against Ukraine has clearly showed that there is a coalition already, and the center of the coalition is not in Moscow, but at this time is in Beijing. And the more time passes, the more it is evident that that it is that Russia is fighting a proxy war, and it's it's being the leader in that war is China, and we have to rethink the way that Eurasian or transatlantic and European and Asian geopolitics works in this new environment, and we cannot take separate single elements and just and think that we are dealing now with Russia. We cannot deal with Russia without dealing with China. We cannot help Ukraine without taking the bigger picture, without keeping bigger picture in mind. That means that the victory in Ukraine against Russia is also partially a victory against China. So we are already in that period. Loss in Ukraine is also loss to China. A Western loss, European loss, call it what you want. So basically, we are, maybe it's too early to be academic about it, because every single day brings up new information and new developments about Chinese new involvement in the war, support in the war. But I think that the broad geopolitical calculations could already be made as to where we are in this new era. This is not a continuation of 1990s. This is a start of 2020s, and we have to see it with fresh look and analyze it with a fresh look.
Mr. Landsbergis, thank you for your conversation and for your time. We wish you all the luck in your all the endeavors that you now have plenty of. So, and thank you for your time, and all the best and all the luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Teodoras.
Thank you.